A Boeing 777 en route from Shanghai and Seoul.
And I thought I was going to die.
From what happened in the cockpit.
There are a lot of questions about the pilots, their experience and their background and their training.
To the response on the runway.
I feel very lucky and blessed that we were able to get those people out in that time.
Tonight, we go in depth on Flight 214. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to KTV News Special Prime Time. I'm Frank Somerville.
And I'm Julie Hayner. There is no great mystery about what happened to Oceana Flight 214. From the very beginning, witnesses suggested the plane was coming in at SFO too low and too slow.
And the NTSB confirmed those accounts on the very first day of its investigation. The question here isn't what happened, but why? Why did a typical landing on a clear, sunny day go so tragically wrong?
The wheels were down, and then I knew something was wrong.
Oh my God! Oh, it's an accident!
As we're approaching the airport, I'm seeing a column of smoke coming from the airport area.
And the whole time we're just looking, and it just seemed to be surreal, like it wasn't happening.
Yeah, that's clearly a column of smoke. Division 3, let's make this a red alert, please. Make this a red alert. Copy that, red alert.
They were too low, too soon.
We're arriving on scene with multiple units. We've got a large plane well involved in fire. Airport units are applying foam.
It just went bang. It couldn't have hit it any harder. It was very blunt.
It never really had a chance.
You can see they actually had water on the fire. Mobile air responding. Yeah, copy that. I'm right behind you.
There was a jolt, and then, the masks dropped down and the whole plane was shaking.
C-14! Copy, attack channel C-14.
And then there was like a big, giant, black smoke. And it just kept coming, bellowing and bellowing and bellowing.
People are trapped in the plane right now. People are trapped in the plane.
So I went inside there, and we're trying to get people out with backboards. A lot of people had injuries. They couldn't move out of their seats, or else they were just scared to move.
In your head, everything goes into slow motion. You just don't believe it's happening. You don't know if you're going to be dead at the end of this slow motion or not.
They're running out, dude. Everybody's just running.
Chutes were deployed. Passengers were still coming down off of the chutes.
We see people arrive and walking around.
People are just walking outside the airplane right now?
Yeah, some people look like it's struggling.
I met up with Lieutenant Monteverdi. I saw him run up the chute of the aircraft. I said, if he can do it, I can do it.
And then I saw a fireman, who was actually a woman, coming through the tail of the plane to help these other people. And then one of the flight attendants grabbed me to go out.
It was so surreal. There was so much chaos going on, and it was quiet.
Since 11:27 last Saturday morning, the KTVU News team has been working nonstop to offer Bay Area viewers a better understanding of what happened on runway 28 left. During this special news hour, we are going to go in depth with air traffic controllers and sit down with first responders. We'll also learn new details about the two teenage girls who did not survive. And we'll hear firsthand about a technique learned in a war zone that helped trauma doctors deal with the mass casualties from Flight 214. The National Transportation Safety Board's investigative team arrived at SFO roughly 12 hours after the crash landing. Its field work is now complete, and investigators have released the scene of the crash back to the airport for salvage operations. Now, the face of the NTSB is its charismatic chairman, Deborah Hersman. She's handled all of the daily briefings and made a point to say that her role is to be an advocate for the traveling public. KTVU's Ken Wayne is live at SFO. He is our field anchor for tonight's in-depth special. First, he's going to bring us up to date with today's developments. Ken?
Julie and Frank, the NTSB's work here at SFO is just about done. The salvage operation actually began last night, and the work to remove the wreckage is underway right now to get that wreckage off the airport property. We want to show you some pictures of the Oceana Airlines Boeing 777. The wreckage remains in a grassy area next to runway 28 left. The plane will now be disassembled and taken to a nearby hangar for further analysis. NTSB Chair Deborah Hersman described the process of removing the plane wreckage.
Those recovery operations of the aircraft of 214 will entail cutting the aircraft structure and taking the aircraft out piece by piece.
The NTSB says today's crash briefing is the last here in the Bay Area and revealed new information about the plane's final approach to runway 28 left. The plane was cleared for a visual approach to the runway, which means the pilots were manually flying the plane and not relying on the autopilot. But cockpit voice recorders indicate the crew had trouble keeping the plane on a proper descent or glide path for the runway.
During the approach, there were statements made in the cockpit, first about being above the glide path, then about being on the glide path, and then later in the recording about being below the glide path.
In addition to being high, then low, the plane's airspeed slowed far below the target airspeed of 137 knots. In fact, it slowed to just 103 knots moments before impact. But the pilots never said anything about the dangerously low airspeed until the plane nearly stalled just before impact.
So at 500 feet, landing checklist is completed, and there is no mention of speed until about 9 seconds before impact when they're at 100 feet. About 5 seconds later and about 3 seconds before impact, there is a call for a go-around.
Oh my God!
By then, it's too late. The jumbo jet's landing gear slams into the seawall, the plane skids down the runway, and the tail section is torn off. New pictures from the NTSB released today show large rocks from the seawall strewn across the runway with other debris left from the collision. The NTSB says so far it has found no mechanical failures with the aircraft.
This crew coming in was flying manually. They intended to fly manually. That's a normal and expected operation for a flight crew coming in to an airport like San Francisco on a clear 10-mile visibility day.
The NTSB also released this picture showing the intense fire damage inside the cabin. Officials said the fire was caused by oil dripping onto a hot engine. Also, the NTSB said one of the Asiana pilots who said he was temporarily blinded by a bright light shining in his eye, they further detailed what that was all about. He said that apparently it could have been a reflection from the sun. None of the other pilots said that they saw a bright light. The pilot who did see it said it did not affect his ability to fly the plane. Frank, Julie?
It sounds odd, but the Asiana pilots were not subjected to drug or alcohol testing following that crash. Federal regulations mandate that U.S. pilots are tested, but foreign pilots are not required to do so. And some lawmakers say it is time for that to change.
If that crash occurs in the United States, regardless of a domestic or foreign carrier, the pilot should have a drug and alcohol test after that crash.
Congressman Larson is on the House Aviation Subcommittee. That committee is currently looking at what regulations and agreements need to be addressed to change the current rules. Now, at San Francisco International Airport alone, there are 31 different nations flying 27 airlines in and out on a constant basis. And in addition to all the various languages, each carrier also has its own rules, its own regulations, and its own training procedures.
The crash of Flight 214 is already prompting a move to standardize the way pilots around the globe are trained. We've spent a good part of this week investigating the safety of foreign airlines taking off and landing at American airports and getting you some answers. A safe landing for today's Asiana Flight 214 with the wreckage of Saturday's crash still clearly in view. As the National Transportation Safety Board continues its investigation into the deadly crash, the Federal Aviation Administration is now focused on making changes that will impact international travel. In a statement we received from the FAA, the agency said, quote, "It is now working on the most comprehensive change in pilot training for more than 2 decades to enhance safety significantly." Democratic Senator Charles Schumer is leading the charge.
This crash and other recent crashes demonstrate a troubling pattern. The pilots in these crashes are mishandling airspeed, which can lead to fatal stalls.
Schumer and other lawmakers are urging the FAA to push international carriers to require their pilots to undergo rigorous training, similar to U.S. pilots. Schumer says if an airline fails to do so, it should be banned from flying into American airspace. Gary Seacott is a retired commercial pilot who lives here in the Bay Area. He has 50 years of flying experience, with much of the time flying international routes.
You can't just use hours as an indication of somebody's experience.
Pilots from smaller nations with mostly international flying assignments may land and take off just once or twice a week. But Seacott says that's not the case for most American pilots.
Now you get on one of these United planes, it goes to Chicago and Pittsburgh and Denver and blah, 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 and back again. Those guys are bouncing up and down in all kinds of weather, in and out. They can fly an airplane blindfolded.
As it is right now, the FAA is not allowed to test the safety of each airline company, its planes, or their pilots. Perry Flint is the spokesman for the International Air Transport Association in Washington, D.C.
Under the International Convention on Civil Aviation, which is also known as the Chicago Convention, each country is responsible for the safety oversight of its own carriers.
But lawmakers are pushing to change that. Under their proposed new guidelines, co-pilots would need 1,500 hours of flying time instead of 250, and certification to fly specific aircraft. Also, pilots in command would be required to have 1,000 hours in air carrier operations, including as co-pilots. Flint stresses the importance of updating current rules as more and more people take to the air.
I mean, 3 billion passengers, around 44% of the Earth's population will travel by air. Air travel is mass transportation, and yet we're still governed by a structure that really was set up at a time when the vast majority of airlines were instruments of the state.
Boeing estimates its global fleet will double in the next 20 years to more than 35,000 commercial aircraft. With the rapid growth of air travel, especially overseas in places such as Asia, the demand for well-trained pilots is stripping the supply, which means experience is at a premium. Many pilots point out that at altitude, sophisticated computer programs do a great deal of the work, but taking off and landing is still very much the responsibility of the men and women in the cockpit.
The 291 passengers on board Flight 214 came from all over the world and from all walks of life. And now all of those survivors share a common bond.
We'll be hearing their stories throughout this news hour. We begin with KTVU's Mike Meback and a young Taekwondo champ who returned from Korea with a gold medal, now lost, and a story he'll tell for the rest of his life.
Martial arts student David Schimmel was in the middle of the 777. He and 8 other people from a Taekwondo center in Scotts Valley were sitting between rows 16 and 19. Their trip to Korea for competition and training had a terrifying ending.
That first bump wasn't as scary. It was rough. And then once we got sideways, then we started, fetal position and getting scared. There was people hurt. There was, luggage. Everything fell too. Like everything fell apart. There's people kind of trapped, climbing over stuff to get out. I don't know. I was kind of clear-headed throughout that part until we got off the plane. Then a freak out happens.
Incredibly, no one in the group of 9 was seriously hurt. Schimmer's gold medal in the competition left behind somewhere in the debris.
Now, from Saturday's crash come stories of heroism as first responders share their accounts of what happened.
Coming up next, in their own words, how the men and women entrusted to save lives jumped into action just moments after the first calls came in.
Plus, new photos from that day never seen before.
We're arriving on scene with multiple units. We've got a large plane well involved in fire. Attention, all companies and units in the field. A red alert has been struck for the airliner crash at SFO. A red alert has been struck in the city and county of San Francisco.
The Ashiana crash is the kind of disaster that crews are constantly training for, but don't often experience. Tonight, we are hearing in depth from some of those first responders. Firefighters from San Francisco and San Mateo County rushed to the site of the deadly crash. Adrenaline was pumping as first responders ran up the chute into the smoldering plane.
We had elderly. We had a woman with a gentleman who was standing over her. We had somebody that was partially trapped, As it turns out, there was a small person stuck between the seats. When we first got back there and saw these people, it was actually pretty clear back there. There was not a lot of smoke, there was not a lot of fire. But by the time we removed the final victim, the conditions were that the fire was banking down on us. We had heavy black smoke.
In the aftermath of tragedy, stories of reluctant heroes can emerge.
And those efforts are shining through tonight in new pictures we obtained that were taken just moments after Flight 214 skidded to a stop. We spoke with 3 first responders about what it was like. 2 of them, Officer Jim Cunningham on the left and Lieutenant Gaetano Caltagirone, actually rushed into the burning plane without any special breathing apparatus because they knew there were people inside who needed to be rescued. The 3rd person is Officer Antoinette Valenzuela. She was just transferred to SFO. In fact, the day the plane went down was only her 4th day working at the airport. And this is what happened on that day in their own words.
There are people laying on the tarmac with critical injuries, head injuries.
One female was bleeding from the back of her head, and she was in and out of consciousness. The other one in and out of consciousness with a broken leg. It looked like it was broken. And the older gentleman was in and out, moaning and pointing to his back.
The one thing I didn't hear was screaming out loud.
It was weird. It was quiet. There's no sound for me. And we spoke about this together. There's no sound, and there's people just moving around in shock. There was no screaming, people like screaming in hysterics or crying in hysterics.
What did it smell like?
There was that diesel jet kerosene smell, the burnt grass smell, the smoke, some burnt plastic smell, and a burnt electrical wire smell.
I remember the plane going up in flames. I'm still standing with the 3 victims, and I'm looking, and at this point fire is over there shooting foam and water onto the flames. It looked like it was getting bigger and bigger. At that point I thought it was going to explode, and I'm saying to myself, there's nowhere for us to go.
The little boy did not have any shoes or socks, and his sister, she had 1 tennis shoe and 1 black sock on. So, and then the little girl goes to me, I can't walk, it hurts. So I threw the little girl on my back, and I started walking. I heard a couple little explosions from the fire, and the little girl started crying. I said, don't worry, you're gonna be okay. Inside the plane, all the upper luggage compartments were broken down, and they were like down. It was almost like it was just torn apart. Somebody went in there with like a tornado.
You couldn't get your foot down on anything to get a good movement because everything was just tossed around. The seats were tossed, the luggage compartments collapsed. Then everybody's luggage and everything they had in there was all over the ground.
Is there ever a moment where you think about, I could get killed here?
There was a moment, and when I was looking at it, going, when is it really time for me to say, Jim, let's get out of here?
I remember I was inside the plane, and the smoke was coming down, and there's a gentleman there. I don't think he spoke English. I just still remember his eyes and scared and shock and stuff. We touched him on his shoulder and just stared at him. I still remember his eyes just staring at us. And we just kind of like, I don't know if he's sure he spoke English or anything, but I guess the eye contact, he knew we were going to get him out of there. We weren't going to leave him behind.
When you're in the middle of something like that, are you scared?
There's a certain amount of fear that you have, but I mean, there's, that your adrenaline's pumping at the same time. And you're thinking, these people need to get out of here.
I looked up, and there's just a big black cloud. And it wasn't like a cloud that was stationary. It was moving. And I starting to see it swirl and start coming towards us.
And the only scary part was that when you saw that flame come up and going, okay, when do we pull out? When do we pull out? Yeah. And then all of a sudden, you focus on something, and then you forget about it.
I just thought to myself, I don't know what she was thinking, but I thought, I can't let go of this person. We're almost out, we're almost out. And I was just looking at that, I go, we can't get out of here. I was thinking in my mind.
In a case like this, you have 4 kids, you have a little girl. Do you think about your family at all in the middle of all of this?
I never thought about it, really. No, really, I don't think so. I just do, I guess I went on autopilot.
Is there a face that you will always remember?
The kids. Seeing them scared that they didn't know where their parents were. So.
That makes you emotional talking about that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I didn't get home till about 8 o'clock that night. I started at 6 in the morning. Took a shower. I was pretty beat up, yeah, emotionally and physically. But luckily, I was able to get a few hours of sleep, get up at 4 o'clock and come back to work.
I got home and I just decided to get cleaned up because you still had the smoke and the jet fuel smell on you, and it felt like it was just coming out of your pores. So.
Yeah. And then I just remember that night my wife gave my daughter a nice bath. She smelled nice and fresh. And I put her on the rocking chair at night, turn off all the lights, that little mobile with little stars at night, and a little music playing. I remember just rocking her, and she's just sucking on our pacifier. I just remember that fresh baby smell. And I felt so relaxed after. And my wife came in later on, both of us passed out in the rocker.
You know, talking to them was really something, and all three of those officers were very humble, and they all wanted me to stress that they were only doing what they are trained to do, and that there were a lot of other police, fire, and emergency crews who were working just as hard as they were.
On board Flight 214, two teenage girls, close friends with big dreams for the future.
When we return, the lives cut tragically short.
Horrified, I started to cry. I even posted on Facebook, I'm like crying for the people. I was horrified for them. I was just hoping everybody was okay.
From SFO today, we got this perspective as crews began to clear the crash site of Flight 214. Debris, large and small, including the wings and the fuselage, have to be removed from the tarmac first. Then the runway will need to be inspected and necessary repairs made before the airport can return to normal operations. Now, in emergencies, you may have heard that flight crews sometimes use the phrase souls on board to describe survivors of a plane crash.
There were 307 souls on that 777. Two of them did not make it. KTVU's Janet Katsuyama tells us about the teenage girls and close friends whose big dreams were cut short.
It was a beautiful, clear summer day, the beginning of a journey for two girls from China to California, excited, hopeful, and embarking on a trip to learn English, broaden their horizons, and perhaps get a glimpse to a future path to college in another country, life in a bigger world. The two girls were close friends. Their dreams ended June 6th here on this runway in San Francisco. Ye Meng Yuan and Wang Lingjia first met as girls in junior high school, and at 16 years old, they were blossoming into young women. Ye had already accomplished a lot. Her first name, Meng Yuan, means harmonious dream. And harmony is something she loved. She was a singer and a pianist, performing here for a New Year's concert. Ye excelled at academics, loved physics and English, and had recently won a speech contest. Wang, whose given name Lingjia means beautiful jade, was known for her beautiful smile. She enjoyed art and calligraphy, an elected class leader who worked at her school's TV and radio stations, and she dreamed of becoming a journalist. On her web messaging page, she typed one word, go, just a day before leaving China. The girls' big dreams were nurtured in Jiangshan, a city 283 miles southwest of Shanghai, at their elite high school, which sent many students on summer study tours to the U.S. The girls, eager to go, reportedly pleaded with their parents, saying one wouldn't go without the other. Their parents finally agreed. Photos of Wang's parents after hearing about the crash show their grief, learning that the goodbyes they said when their daughter left would be their last. Those families this week made that same journey across the Pacific to retrieve the girls' bodies, passing the wreckage as their plane landed. In China and throughout the world, the girls have touched hearts, people sending messages of love and support.
We hope we can send the two who died our wishes and that they will be in heaven in peace.
In the girls' hometown, their classmates held a beautiful candlelight tribute, giving friends a moment together to grieve in silence. And as dusk fell, they wrote messages on large orange lanterns, lifting them to the sky, for two girls who will be remembered in death for the light they brought to people's lives.
There were prayers and songs tonight in Southern California for those two friends from China. The girls were scheduled to spend 3 weeks at the West Valley Christian School and Church in the San Fernando Valley.
Tonight, the community there came together to mourn. Amazing Grace was performed in Mandarin, and 2 wreaths were placed on the stage to honor the two friends who shared so much joy together in life. After Flight 214 crashed, it wasn't the flight crew that first declared an emergency. It was actually the controllers inside the tower at SFO.
When we return, the role of air traffic control on Saturday from 2 men who know firsthand.
Aviation 214 heavy emergency vehicles are responding. We have everyone on their way.
We now know that in the final crucial seconds before the Oceana crash, the pilot of the 777 was fighting to make the runway. But what was happening in the control tower at SFO?
Controllers say that their job is to keep the plane separated, but they don't actually know what's going on inside the cockpit unless they get word from the pilots.
Our KTVU field anchor Ken Wayne is live at SFO and tells us that last Saturday, air traffic control had no warning until the plane crashed.
That's right, Julie and Frank. It is up to the pilot in command to declare an emergency, not the air traffic controllers. I talked to a couple of air traffic controllers, veterans who have many years here at SFO, and they said it was not unusual for several emergency calls a week to be called in by pilots coming in for a landing. That gives them time to get emergency vehicles out on the field. Usually nothing serious ever happened. In this case, there was no warning whatsoever. Mark Nelson and Bill Pong are retired air traffic controllers who have a combined 36 years of experience in SFO's control tower. Both are pilots, and both have given a lot of thought to what happened with Flight 214. As far as you can tell, is there anything that the air traffic controllers could have done to have prevented this?
No, absolutely not.
The controllers are not going to declare an emergency prior to the pilot would declare an emergency if they thought an emergency was warranted.
It was a controller who made the emergency call after the 777 crashed last Saturday.
We see people, and they should need the immediate attention because they're alive and walking around.
These men say there's no way controllers know there's a problem on board a plane unless the flight crew tells them.
Pilots fly the aircraft and controllers separate the airplanes. We don't know what's going on in the cockpit. We don't know what's going on with the aircraft.
The controllers also can't tell if a plane is flying too low or slow for approach. Radar tells them how fast the plane is going over the ground, but radar coverage indicating aircraft speed ends about a mile from the runway.
A controller could not look out the window and say, wow, he's too low, you know.
Or too slow.
Or too slow, exactly.
You know, I was there 16 years and I never saw anything like that.
Both men listened to recordings of the conversation between the controllers and pilots and say the fact that no emergency was declared by the pilots is telling.
Yeah, I was kind of expecting that, you know, you would heard something from them, but the first time you hear from them, the accident already happened.
Mark Nelson knows the SFO controller who was handling the Oceana flight.
He's a young controller who I worked with before I retired. I think he did an excellent job. He did everything he was supposed to do.
But he worries about the psychological trauma that comes with witnessing such an event. He knows what it's like to talk to a pilot in trouble and then learn that that aircraft has crashed.
My heart would be pounding. My hands were kind of clammy. Even though you may not have been a contributing factor, you're still second-guessing anything you might do. And it takes a little while to get back into a rhythm.
He says there's no doubt all the controllers who witnessed the crash will be offered counseling.
You want to make sure that when you come back whole, that you're ready to go back to work and that you can resume your operation, resume the same rhythm and do the job that you're supposed to do and not be affected by the people that are out there.
So the good news is attitudes about counseling have changed over the years. In the old days, you might have been told to shake it off and get back to work. It's a lot different now. Frank, Julie.
Slow and low. From the first hours following the crash, those two words have been used to describe the final approach of Oceana Flight 214. You may have seen the split screen comparison we created. On the top, the Oceana flight. On the bottom, a successful landing. You can see just how much higher the plane that lands safely is flying when compared to Flight 214. The Oceana jet hits the seawall as it lands, while the other plane touches down at about the same point on the runway where the wreckage of 214 now rests.
So did the pilots at the controls on Flight 214 miss obvious clues that should have alerted them to serious trouble ahead? Julianne Fox worked for Boeing and helped write the flight manual for the 777. We talked to her today. She says pilots can become so fixated on one issue that they have what's called inattentional blindness, where they miss even visual and audio clues. In fact, she says back in 1972, a cockpit crew got so fixated on a light bulb that had burned out, they ended up crashing, killing 101 people on board.
Let's say that I put my landing gear down and I didn't get green lights, and I'm focused on that. I can miss that I've got chimes going off that I'm leaving my altitude. I can miss that I'm enclosing on the ground. They took a perfectly good aircraft and it flew into the ground because they were very focused on one thing.
She says in the Oceana crash, a yellow flashing master light would have gone on, telling the crew they were flying too low. In addition, the lights along the runway were red, also showing the approach was too low. So the question remains, where was the pilot's attention in the moments before that crash?
The flight attendants on board helped evacuate nearly 300 passengers, and stories of their bravery are being told around the world. One man and 5 women, one in a wheelchair, returned home to Seoul today. The flight crew was met at the gate with hugs from the airline's CEO. Before leaving San Francisco, the flight's cabin manager said they're all praying for the families of the 2 teenagers killed and for all the survivors. The other 6 flight attendants remain in the hospital, including the 3 who were thrown from the back of the plane. And a 15-year-old girl from Colorado said someone in that cabin crew helped guide her and her family to safety. All 5 family members were treated for injuries from the impact of the crash.
KTVU's Mike Maybach now on the chaos that she and her 2 siblings witnessed firsthand.
The Jang family from Colorado was sitting in the back of the plane. The brother and 2 sisters were on their way home from vacation in Korea with their parents and looking forward to the end of their 10-hour flight when the plane hit the seawall.
I couldn't breathe because I got the wind knocked out of me, so I couldn't breathe for a couple of seconds.
Joseph suffered a back fracture from the impact. His older sister, Esther, sprained a foot, and younger sister, Sarah, a broken finger.
After everything stopped, and then I realized I was alive, and I looked over and I saw my brother and sister. They were both fine. And then I looked over at my mom and my dad, and they were both on the floor because their seats fell down.
Their father was dozing as the plane came down.
The only thing I remember is, a loud noise as I woke up from my sleep as the plane was landing, and then the next thing I remember is that I'm laying down on a field, and first responders are working on me.
They were among 62 patients rushed to San Francisco General. Reflecting on the crash, they and the other survivors share one overwhelming emotion.
We are very grateful, very thankful that we're all alive, and it certainly was a very scary moment for us.
When we return, another unsung hero shares her story.
We're going to introduce you to a woman who used her experience in war zones to help treat those most injured on Flight 214.
Some of them had burns, they had fractures, they had internal injuries, internal bleeding.
This is the scene right now on runway 28 left at San Francisco International Airport, where crews have begun removing the wreckage of Flight 214. Immediately after this primetime special on the 10 o'clock news, we'll have a live report on the timeline for the cleanup now underway.
All kinds of unsung heroes responded to that disaster, from the ambulance drivers to police officers who directed traffic to the airport staff who helped stranded passengers at SFO.
Dozens of doctors and nurses at San Francisco General were doing what they do every day when the crash victims began arriving in waves. KTVU's John Fowler talked with the lead surgeon who brought her war zone training to the trauma center.
San Francisco General's Trauma Center took the most severely injured.
We knew that our time was coming. We kept thinking it was going to be an earthquake. I mean, this is the biggest disaster our hospital has ever seen.
Chief of Surgery Dr. Margaret Knudsen took charge in her Air Force camouflage surgeon's cap. She's made 7 trips overseas to military combat hospitals, including Iraq, and is the only civilian surgeon to operate on a modern war front.
I was too old to enlist, so I went as a volunteer instead. I learned a tremendous amount from them. I thought I was going to be teaching, and I did a little bit of teaching, but I learned a lot from what they were doing down there and how to care for not only very sick people, but multiple people at the same time. And I can tell you that really helped me on Saturday when all these people came at the same time. Because you can have one or two reactions. You can start to panic. But the better approach is to step back and say, I'm okay, and then assigning people as organized teams, and that's what I did. And I think really that helped get people through this.
Doctors say ambulances got the most critically injured to San Francisco General and into surgery within about 45 minutes. Dr. Knudsen says so many were hurt so badly, surgeons performed some trauma tricks adapted from battlefield medicine.
We did what we learned from the military in these patients, which was to do limited amounts of surgery each time you go, rather than try to fix everything at the same time. Using temporary closures, temporary shunts for vascular injuries, all those things really perfected by the military surgeons over this last 10 years of war. In these cases, I think really helped these patients survive.
She's proud of the flags that were flown in combat zones in her honor, and says disaster drills and practice can only do so much. She credits first responders, on-scene triage, which got the most severely injured on ambulances first, and her hospital staff, the chiefs of every medical department who came in on days off, the doctors, the nurses, and paramedics, even housekeepers.
You don't really know how you're going to do on your own until it happens, right? And boy, people stepped up and did a phenomenal job, which is why I think we, were able to save these patients.
Now she says she has even more to teach trauma surgeons here. It's the tragedies of war and disasters, she says, that help save lives.
7 patients remain at San Francisco General, including 3 in critical condition. 2 people are still hospitalized at Stanford. 1 is in serious and the other is in good condition. 5 patients are recovering with less serious injuries at 3 other local hospitals.
When Asiana Flight 214 crashed on Saturday, panicked passengers pulled out their cell phones and called 911. Many were frantic, suggesting that the help was a little slow to arrive.
Here are 2 of those calls that came into the highway patrol.
There's a bunch of fire trucks and a couple of ambulances. There's 1 or 2, but there's a lot of people hurting on the ground.
We have people over here who weren't found, and they're burned really badly. There is a woman out here on the street on the runway who is pretty much burned very severely on the head, and we don't know what to do.
The San Francisco Fire Department spokeswoman has told us that medical personnel, including EMTs and paramedics, were on the scene within minutes of the crash. She says ambulances at major incidents such as the crash perform a transport role and were dispatched from a nearby staging area.
Now, throughout this hour, you've been hearing stories from passengers on Flight 214.
Coming up next, a Bay Area businessman, one of the last off the plane, tells us his tale and how he helped other passengers in that time of crisis.
I'm thinking if that plane flips over and we're landing that way, we're all dead.
Oftentimes, in airline accidents, weather can be a big part of it. Things like wind and fog and rain and hail. Well, San Francisco Airport this time of year, you oftentimes have wind and you oftentimes have fog. And this time of year, dense fog in the morning is not uncommon, or strong west winds to 25 miles an hour. But on Saturday, that was not the case. The National Weather Service issued an aviation forecast discussion for VFR, visual flight rules, saying that basically you could see a long way. How far could you see? Well, the actual conditions, visibility, 10-mile visibility. The clouds were mainly above 1,600 feet, and the winds were relatively light out of the southwest at 8 miles per hour. So when this happened, we looked at the weather conditions and immediately knew that the chances of this being a weather-related accident were pretty small.
On that sunny Saturday morning, one of the last passengers to leave Flight 214 was a venture capitalist from San Francisco. Ben Levy was looking out the window as the crew told passengers to fasten their seatbelts.
Obviously, it turned out to be anything but a routine landing. KTVU's Mike Mabeck tells us in the first terrifying minutes of that crash, the experienced traveler found himself taking action.
39-year-old Ben Levy is a businessman who was headed home from a business trip. He was seated in seat 30K, an emergency exit row. On final approach, Levy was looking out the window to see if there were any windsurfers out on the bay when he sensed something was wrong.
My first instinct was like, why are we so low? It felt like we were very low too soon. So too low too soon is kind of what came through my mind. But I'm thinking, well, the guy's computer, it's a fancy plane, we're almost arriving. I dismissed it. And then I started feeling, the engine roaring, like to maximum power it feels like. The plane starts shaking, and there's this massive amount of water that's splashing everywhere. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, there's really something wrong now, because the guy realized that we're not gonna make the runway. And then we hit really bad. It was a really violent shock. At that point, everybody screams and thinking, oh my God, this is not normal, what's happening? Of course, people have, bleeding, some are crying, some are in shock.
Levy had no way of knowing that 3 flight attendants in the back of the plane had been ejected. He started evacuating passengers through the exit door.
And now we gotta get out. So that was my instinct, just opening the door and then starting shouting, we're okay, we're gonna be okay, get out, quick, help each other out, leave everything behind, get out, get out, get out. You usually have those slides in there, and they weren't gone. They were actually ripped off through the crash. And so the people had to step on debris of the plane. There was an older gentleman laying down there in one of the chairs. It sounded like either he had a heart attack or he was in shock. He just didn't move. And then I went to the back, and there was a woman that was stuck with her leg in between chairs. That's the one I got through. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of smoke there.
A San Francisco resident realized he had bruised ribs and could not carry anyone off the plane. At that same moment, that is when he saw a female firefighter come on board.
And I'm thinking, okay, God, thank God, help is on the way. They're gonna help those people and carry them out. And it's not about one hero, it's about those people coming together to minimize the loss of lives.
Well, it is a question so many people have asked us. Why did some of those passengers on board take their luggage with them as they escaped from that burning plane?
In an evacuation, passengers are always told to leave their personal belongings behind. But we've seen a number of photos from the crash site clearly showing people with their carry-on bags and other items.
How many people couldn't get out because she's sitting there getting this bag out?
It felt okay. It felt like, okay, well, it's not going to be a life or death decision if you spend another 3 seconds in that plane, which now I understand was very wrong.
Flight crews say stopping to grab luggage in an airline emergency can put that person's life at risk, as well as other passengers. KTVU's Ken Wayne is our resident pilot and field anchor tonight.
And Ken, like the rest of us, you've been covering this story for the past 5.5 days and also monitoring each of those NTSB briefings. So what stands out for you?
Well, Frank, immediately it's how much we've learned in such a short period of time. We knew right away on that Saturday morning how great the weather was, so we could pretty much rule that out right off the top. And as of today, the latest NTSB briefing, we know there was no mechanical failure that's been discovered so far. The engines were operating properly. All of the control surfaces of the aircraft appeared to be operating normally. So we can pretty much zero this in to what was going on inside the cockpit. We know the plane was flying too low and too slow. The question is now, why was that happening? That's what the NTSB has to get to the bottom of.
Ken, we've heard the stories of flight attendants fighting the fire, evacuating passengers on their backs, and being trapped by those emergency chutes that deployed inside the aircraft. Do you think passengers will now see this role differently?
Well, at least for the short term I do, and of course, full disclosure, my wife is a flight attendant, so I hear about this all the time. There's a lot of frustration with passengers as airlines cut back on service, but you look at what happened here in this crash. This is the reason flight attendants exist. They are there to get people safely off an airplane in an emergency. You have these young women who called for the evacuation, asked the captain if there should be an evacuation. They were told to wait. Then they actually got people off that plane, risked their own lives doing so, and got injured. And remember, 3 of the flight attendants were ejected from that plane. So hopefully people will have a new respect for flight attendants.
All right, Ken, thank you.
Well, as you can see, we have migrated over to the news desk so that we can bring you tonight's 10 o'clock news, including an exclusive interview with the mother of a missing baby girl.
We hope you have found this primetime special interesting and informative. Some questions remain about the crash of Oceania Flight 214, and in the weeks and months to come, we will continue to look for answers.